Okay, welcome back. We're doing October, November 24, question paper 13. And just like the other ones, we start at the bottom. So, what is likely to happen if there is a rise in international value of currency? So that will be an appreciation. Now remember, what happens with an appreciation is that price of exports go down. Price of exports go up, total exports go down, price of imports go up, it's been a long day, total imports go up. Okay, so once we know about what happens with that with an appreciation, then we should be able to figure out from the options. So, fall in the foreign currency price of its exports, no. Fall in the volume of its exports, yes. We can see that here from what we know about an appreciation. Rise in domestic currency price of its imports, no. It's a rise in the foreign currency price of its imports. And a rise in the domestic price level, no. Remember that an appreciation is part of contractionary monetary policy, which is designed to move AD to the left. Therefore, it will decrease price level, not increase price level. 29. Improvement in terms of trade. Remember, that's export prices relative to import prices. So what we're looking for is the export prices to rise, and we're looking for the import prices to fall, or to remain the same, or to rise as long as import prices rise by more than them. Okay, so index of export prices over index of imports. Price of imports falls more than price of imports, no. That would result in a deterioration of the terms of trade. No change in the price of exports, but a fall in import prices, that would result in an improvement. It has nothing to do with the value, and it has nothing to do with the volume. It is purely the prices of imports and exports. 28. Two forms of protectionism. There's a total ban. So a total ban is an embargo, and all goods have to be of a specified standard. Sometimes we refer to that as artificially high standards, which is a form of red tape, or also, therefore, a form of an administrative barrier that is imposed in order to protect the domestic industries from the imports. So, correct answer there would therefore be C. 27. What is most likely to cause current account deficit? So, simple terms, break it down simply always. Current account deficit, imports are likely to go up, exports are likely to come down. So that is what we will be looking for. If we have a recession in the domestic economy, our exports would drop, but so would our imports. So current account deficit, it's not the most likely. Relatively high rate of inflation, yes, because it would make these exports over here less competitive internationally. And it would also make imports more competitive because they would now be cheaper in relative terms to what we can buy on the domestic market. Undervalued exchange rate, no. Again, fall in exchange rate like a depreciation would result in possibly a current account surplus, because our exports would rise and our imports would fall. And high labour productivity is definitely not going to result in our exports dropping and our imports going up. It may result in the opposite effect, with our exports up and our imports dropping. 26. A country currently producing at X. Okay, so they're currently producing here and they're making 1,000 trucks and 5,000 cars. They decide to specialize, so they decide to only make 10,000 cars. It finds that it can import one truck in exchange for 4 cars. Okay, so the trade agreement is one truck for 4 cars. What is the result in the domestic market if it exports all of the cars. So we're talking here in terms of extra trucks, okay? So what we need to do is use the trading agreement. First, what they're going to do is they're going to make 10,000 and they're going to keep 5,000 for themselves, which means that they're going to sell the additional 5,000. For every 4 cars that we sell, we get 1 truck. So therefore, if we sell 5,000 cars, we're going to receive 1,250 trucks. Okay, so if we are now importing 1,250, then extra trucks is what we now import from the trade agreement minus what we were producing previously before we decided to specialize. They would be the extra trucks that we're generating. 1,250 minus 1,000 is an extra 250 trucks after we specialize and we then trade with the other country. Question 25. What is not a valid explanation of why a government might allow a deficit on the balance of payments to continue? Standard of living is increased if the level of cheap food imports is significant. Okay, yeah, that might be a reason why we would continue with a deficit. Larger surplus on other parts of the balance of payments. Remember, we have capital accounts and financial accounts too, so that could also be a reason why we allow a deficit on the current account to build. Foreign direct investment might help to finance the deficit. Again, that comes true in the components, or it relates to C here, which is through the capital and financial accounts. They could offset the deficit that we have on the current account. And balance of payments must always balance. That is therefore not a valid explanation about why we would allow a deficit to continue, because that's our objective, is to allow it to balance. So it's not an explanation about why we would continue to have a deficit accruing. (24) A country subsidizes domestic production of manufactured goods. What is the most likely outcome? Okay, well, it's definitely not going to be a rise in unemployment, because we're subsidizing domestic production, so they're likely to increase their supply, which means they'll take on more workers, so unemployment is likely to fall. It is also not likely to be a rise in inflation, because subsidizing will reduce the price that the product is sold for, and therefore the price level is unlikely to rise significantly. It will also not reduce or not result in a rise in imports, because we're now making more domestically, so there might be more sold on the domestic market, and the level of imports might actually drop instead. And it may result, or the most likely outcome, is a rise in economic growth through, say for example, either an increase in the exports from subsidizing the domestic production, or through an increase in consumption from aggregate demand, as more products are made and sold at a lower price on the domestic market, which means that consumption in the domestic market may increase, aggregate demand may increase, and that may generate economic growth. 23 is very simple. What does it mean when a government has a budget surplus? Budget surplus is government revenue higher than government expenditure. None of the others here are relevant. National debt only increases when we have a deficit, not when we have a surplus. The national debt will decrease when we have a surplus, as long as they're using the additional funds to pay off the debt. Expansionary fiscal policy is relating to a deficit, not a surplus, because it is government revenue down and government expenditure up, and it's nothing to do with imports and exports. It's purely revenue and expenditure from the government. Changes in fiscal policy can affect the distribution of income and wealth. Which combination of fiscal policies would most likely be regressive? Okay. A rise in the standard rate of income tax. Yeah, that would be regressive. but a fall in the standard rate of indirect taxes would not be regressive. Because low-income earners would then be able to pay less tax as a percentage of their income. A rise in the rate of income tax charged at higher levels of income, that's not going to be regressive either, that's going to be progressive. A fall in the charge made for visits to a doctor, again, that's not going to be regressive. And a rise in the level of unemployment benefit, again, that is not going to be regressive either. Remember, regressive, we're looking at the low income earners will be the ones that are receiving less benefit. So a fall in the lowest level of income when income tax has to be paid, that would be regressive, because it means that we're essentially receiving less money before we have to pay income tax. So a fall in the lowest level of income could be, you might have a tax-free allowance of $10,000 a year, you only pay tax after you earn 10k. If that falls to $8,000 a year, you are now paying tax in between $8,000 to $10,000. That makes it regressive. You're paying a higher percentage of your income on tax than you were previously. And if there is a fall in the rate of inheritance tax, then that is also regressive, because people who have inheritance tax are paying less, and they tend to be wealthy individuals, or at least wealthier than the low income earners, and they now have to pay a smaller proportion on the value of the assets that are left to them. Supply side policies often has fiscal consequences. Which statement is not correct? Okay, so reduced rates of tax on higher incomes increases an economy's LRAS and has an expansionary effect on AD. That is true. It can increase LRAS through incentivizing people to go to work, and it also has an expansionary effect on AD because it is an expansionary fiscal policy designed to give people more disposable income and to increase the consumption and investment components of aggregate demand. Reduced consumer infrastructure spending reduces an economy's LRAS. Okay, no. So just because we reduce spending, what it does is it will reduce our AD, but it's not going to reduce our AS, right? First of all, it's not a supply side policy if it reduces AS. Has a short-term expansionary effect on AD. That's also wrong. It has a short-term contractionary effect on AD. AD will move left, not move right, when government spending drops. So therefore, increased government expenditure on training increases LRAS. Yes, increase in productivity can increase LRAS. Increase in government spending, expansionary effect on AD. Supports technical, for A, increased government spending supports technical progress, beneficial long-term supply side effects. Yeah, true. May have short-term inflationary consequences. Also true, depending on the level of capacity in the economy. But if we're at stage 3 in that Keynesian curve that we know, then yeah, it will have short-term inflationary consequences until we can shift the LRAS with the technical progress, and then the inflation rate should drop down. 20. If interest rates are reduced, what is most likely to decrease? Borrowing from firms will definitely not decrease, it will increase. It becomes easier to borrow because they have to pay back less money. Consumer spending will also not decrease, it will also increase. Same reason, easier to borrow money, we spend more. Import prices will not decrease, they will rise, but the export prices will decrease. And that's because if we reduce the interest rates, what happens is that we have a decreased demand for the currency, and then it creates a depreciation. And just like we had with the appreciation previously, we have the opposite effect. Price of exports go down, total exports go up if it's a depreciation, price of imports go up and total imports go down. So therefore our export prices will drop. Question 19. A government is considering building a large hospital. The impact on the country's price level will depend partly on the amount of expensive raw materials they import and the level of unemployment. Okay. What combination of imports for materials for the hospital and the level of unemployment most likely to lead to the largest rise in price level? Okay, so it's relating to our capacity. If we just take it as unemployment first, we'll actually want a low rate of unemployment, because that will mean that we're near full capacity, right? So the nearer we are to full capacity, just like the curve I drew previously, then we're somewhere along here, we'll have a bigger change in the price level. Unemployment is high, will be somewhere along here, if I can draw it, which means that we will actually have minimal changes in price level, if even have any at all. The import of materials we would want to be high, because if we need to import those materials, if the imports of materials needed for the hospitals is high, then therefore that's going to result in the biggest increase in the price level, because we'll have a shift in our aggregate supply to the left possibly. It'll generate some cost push inflation. Okay, this one looks complicated, but it's not really. So what we've got to do here, we've got GDP and we need to convert it into NDP. So just remember, when we have net anything, whether it is NDP or whether it is NNI, which comes from our GNI, essentially all we have to do is we have to take away this capital consumption, which is our depreciation, right? So our net domestic product at market prices will be our GDP at market prices minus our depreciation, which is capital consumption here. That will give us 170k. And then very simple, indirect tax revenue and our subsidies is going to get us from our basic to our market prices. So if our gross value added at basic prices is 180 and our subsidies are 5, then in order to get from the 200 to the 180, and in order to move, like we explained in the previous paper, in any of these cases, in order to get from market to basic, then what we're going to have essentially is, if I can put it down here, we're going to get to 180. We're only including our subsidies and indirect taxes because they're the only things that are taken into account. Subsidies will be added, so plus 5. Indirect taxes to move from market to basic will be taken away. Minus 25, 205 minus 25 gives us 180. Therefore, our indirect tax revenue has to be 25,000. What leads to a rise in frictional unemployment? Remember, frictional unemployment has a number of different subcategories. It's generally relating to the provision of information. An economy moving into a period of a recession, that will create cyclical unemployment, not frictional unemployment. Replacement of workers with computers, that would be structural unemployment. Long-term changes in the economy based on changes in demand. And a change from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial economy. Similarly, you can make an argument that that would be structural in nature. Whereas D, a rise in the number of workers leaving one job to look for another, we call that search unemployment, which is a subcategory of frictional unemployment. I haven't seen a question like this before, so might look complicated, but it's not really, because everything about the circular flow comes back to equilibrium, right? So equilibrium we know is our injections, and that's our total injections. investment, government spending and exports equaling our total leakages, our savings, our taxation and our imports. Okay, so therefore at equilibrium levels of Y and C, Y denotes total income, C denotes consumption, are always the same. That is not true. They don't have to be the same at all. Consumption and total income could be completely different. Governments always adjust G so that the economy is in equilibrium. Not true. Economy will be in equilibrium when I plus G plus X equals S plus T plus M. If I is not equal to S, it is still possible for the national income to be in equilibrium. That is true. Investment does not have to equal saving as long as, and I've said this at the start, as long as the injections here, these three, are equal to these three, then it doesn't matter if one or two of them are out of sync and don't balance. As long as the totality of them are equal, we will be in equilibrium. If the national income is in equilibrium, X must be equal to M. So that's just like A and B. Not true. Again, it's the total. As long as these three are equal to these three, doesn't matter if X is equal to M. There could be more of X or more of M. As long as the three of them are equal, we'll be in equilibrium. Okay, 15. Country experienced an annual deflation rate of 2% for 4 consecutive years. What statement is correct for a 4-year period? So, first of all, the real value of money does not fall. The real value of money will rise when we have deflation. Purchasing power will increase, right? Now, the correct answer here is B, and that's because just like when we looked at the CPI questions, if there's a 2% rate of inflation in year 1, a 2% deflation rate. If there's a 2% deflation rate in year 1 and a 2% deflation rate in year 2, it doesn't work like adding up 2, 4, 6 and 8, right? It's a 2% deflation rate on the previous year, which may work out as an example as, let's say, 1.95% deflation in the actual next year, right? Compared against what it was previously. So the price level will fall by less than 8% over the 4 years. It will not fall by exactly 8%, okay? If you're a bit unsure why, you need a further explanation, go to the other videos that we've done in this set of papers, October, November 24, and have a look for the CPI value questions. There's also ones in October, November 2022, where you show the table and we'll show how we calculate the rate. Question 14. Large-scale farming enterprises uses inputs of labour and capital equipment that are substitutes. Okay, so they're substitutes for one another. Government introduces a policy to subsidise capital equipment. Capital equipment and the price of it therefore will drop, which will increase the demand for capital, and therefore it will decrease the demand for labour. So quantity of labour will decrease. Quantity of capital, because the price goes down, quantity of capital will increase. Okay, very straightforward question. Very low interest rates in an economy encourage economic growth and cause a large increase in house prices. Which group of people is most likely to experience a fall in income and an increase in wealth as a result of these changes? Okay. First of all, young people are not going to experience it. They're unlikely to have savings, which means they won't be obtaining the interest rates from the savings in their bank accounts. Also, if they're living with their parents or buying their own houses, you only can have an increase in wealth if you actually own the asset, right? So in other words, to have the increase in wealth that results, you need to actually physically own the asset in the first place. And therefore, the retired people who own their houses, they're likely to have their income generated from a savings account, for example, or linked to an annuity, which could be based on the interest rates, and therefore their income will drop when the interest rates are low. But because of a large increase in the house that they already own and are not renting, then their increase in wealth will substantially rise as a result of those changes. Question 12. Now this might be new for you guys, I'm not sure yet. Which policy is most likely to solve the free rider problem caused by public goods? You know, this is something that we could have included, or we can include in our essays as well, because it's a good, it's not a very common question that comes up, but it is a good one to add into an essay. So, first of all, taxes or prices will not work. It's a public good, so we don't charge a price. An advertising campaign will not work. An advertising campaign will work in order to address the underconsumption of a merit good, for example. Direct provision is the measure that will work best, and the reason for that, free riders, we know, are people that are consuming the good or the service without having to pay. So in order to stop that, if the government directly provides the goods, they can ensure that everybody has access, which essentially can eliminate the free rider problem, as it's going to create what we would call a universal benefit for everybody. So it's not only the free riders who are benefiting from their use of it without having to pay. It is everybody who is benefiting from it without having to pay through the direct provision. So therefore, there are no more free riders because everybody is getting a universal benefit from the direct provision. Question 11. Combination of classification of good and market change will cause the demand curve to shift to the right. So if we have an inferior good and income decreases, that would be the correct answer. Remember, inferior goods have inverse relationship. If the income decreases, then the demand for an inferior good will increase. Price changes, remember, whether it's inferior or normal, will just result in an extension or contraction. They will not shift the demand curve to the right, which is what we're looking for. And a normal good, if the income decreases, they have a positive relationship, which means income and demand will move in the same direction. Income goes down, demand goes down. But because of the inverse relationship, plus minus relationship between inferior goods, the less income we have, the more we buy the inferior good, the cheap, low quality product. Okay, different areas on the diagram represent different aspects of a market. Which row correctly identifies three variables? Okay, so consumer surplus, remember, here's our equilibrium price. Consumer surplus is the area above the equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve. So RST from equilibrium would be our consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the area below the equilibrium price to the bottom of the supply curve. So SUT or UST. And therefore we can see that our total consumer expenditure would have to be STGO, which is the area that I'll shade here in orange. And if you don't know, you should be able to recognize that anyway, because it's essentially the price for the product multiplied by the quantity, right? And that's exactly what that area represents. Price of the product OS, quantity OG, and that total area represents the total expenditure on the product. Question 9. Which statement is correct? Okay. Cross elasticity, when it's a plus figure, it's a substitute. When it's a negative figure, it's a complement. Income elasticity, when it's a negative figure, it's an inferior good. When it's a positive figure, it could be a normal good, a luxury good, or a necessity good. So if we know our simple signs from XED and YED, we can tell that it is a substitute and inferior. Question 8. Very common style of question. So first of all, calculated at $1. At $1, supply will be 10 plus 10. So supply will be 20, right? Therefore, at $2, the price is going to change by 50%. The quantity or the supply is going to be 10 multiplied by 2, which is going to give us 30. Quantity supplied will be 30 minus 20, which is 10, divided by 20, which is a 50% change. And then all we have to do is we have to know our PES formula. So percentage change in quantity supplied, 50%, divided by percentage change in price, $2 to $1, 100%. 50 over 100 will give us 0.5. Question 7. Chinese government relaxed controls on private house ownership. Private house ownership rose sharply, replacing demands for apartments rented from the state. Okay, so apartments or apartment rents are state controlled, and private house prices are obviously private controlled. What would have been most likely to happen? Very simple. Private house ownership rose sharply, replacing demand. So private house ownership would have shifted the demand curve to the right. Increase in demand for private ownership houses. Very simple. You can see from the diagram, you'd expect their prices to therefore increase. And because they're essentially substitutes for one another, if it replaces the demand, this increase in demand is taken from the demand for state-controlled apartments, which means that the state-controlled apartments would therefore have to have decreased in demand, and therefore their price would have had to decrease. Okay, shoe manufacturers often use leather to make their most expensive shoes. Due to a world shortage of leather, the price of leather has risen. What will be the effect of this price change? Okay, demand for leather shoes will shift to the left, or demand curve for leather shoes will shift to the left. No, that's not true. The supply curve for leather shoes will shift to the left because there's a shortage of it. Demand curve for a substitute for leather shoes will shift to the right. That's true. If the supply curve for leather shoes shifts to the left because of the shortage, there's less available, which means that consumers will switch their consumption to the closest or close substitutes for leather shoes. Supply curve will shift right. That's clearly wrong. Supply curve will shift left. And supply curve for a substitute for leather to make expensive shoes will shift to the right. Not true. How could it shift to the right? Maybe the demand for a substitute for leather to make expensive shoes would shift to the right, but not the supply curve. Question 5. Government wishes to encourage the consumption of a merit good and reduce the consumption of a demerit good. Okay. So minimum price would not work. Confined access would definitely not work if we're trying to increase consumption. Increase advertising on the benefits would be a possible solution, as would subsidizing the goods. However, we would not want to set a minimum price on a demerit good, for the fact that if we set the minimum price, what we're doing is we're increasing the supply of it, right? So we want to restrict or reduce the consumption of that good. Therefore, even though we can subsidize or use increased advertising, the better option would be to put legal controls on output to restrict the amount that can actually be produced for a demerit good, because that would directly reduce consumption. Question 4. What is most likely to be an advantage of the division of labour? That would most likely be an increase in labour productivity. Creativity, definitely not. They're doing the same task all the time. Creativity will be restricted. Flexibility will be restricted and decreased. Again, they're doing the same task every time. Their satisfaction is also likely to decrease as boredom and the repetitive nature of the job eats away at them. But an increase in labour productivity would happen. They get better at doing the same job over and over again. They specialise, they build up their skill set for their job, for that particular role, and therefore the productivity will rise. Factors of production are in different words. rewards match it. Alright, okay. Labour and interest is wrong. Labour is wages. Interest is actually for capital, not a surplus. Enterprise is profit, not dividends. But land is rent. So land is rent, labour is wages, capital is interest, and enterprise is profit. Question 2. What type of good does not consume scarce resources? That is a free good. Economic goods, merit goods, and public goods all are forms of economic goods which do consume scarce resources. They require factors of production to make them. A free good does not consume scarce resources, and it does not have an opportunity cost. Finally, PPC, first thing we do, we see a straight line PPC, just like all the other videos we said before. We label it as a constant, what am I writing here? Constant opportunity cost, because it's a straight line PPC, the opportunity cost does not change. Does not tell us if they're normal goods, inferior goods. Does not tell us if they're self-sufficient in the production. Opportunity cost does not fall. Opportunity cost would fall or increase, for example, if the PPC curve was concave, like so. But it shows constant opportunity cost between food and drink. Straight line PPC shows exactly that.